Probably the most fun part of typology, and often the end goal behind studying typology, is figuring out other people's types. This is also one of the more frustrating parts of typology. In many cases, another person's type can be extraordinarily elusive, like trying to catch smoke. The more you look at the person, the less certain you become. Little details keep popping up that you are not sure how to account for with typology. From one perspective, you feel certain they are one type, but from another angle, that doesn't seem so certain. What's more is when a friend whom you were sure was one type comes and tells you excitedly that they are really a completely opposite type. Even worse is when you are trying to confirm your own type for yourself, but never feel satisfied. In part 1 of this little series, I would like to explain my theories behind why typing can be so frustrating, as well as 2 basic tips I've learned on how to better go about recognizing these real-life examples of Jungian preferences. The first thing I think I've noticed is that many people use primarily intuitive functions when typing people. When intuition is used to determine type, it becomes a bit like an internet quiz to determine which characters from Game of Thrones each of your friends are. It becomes a game of association. As I've mentioned before, I think intuition is like a blurred lens, which obscures details of an object, but makes it easier to imagine what other objects it now looks like. So when using an intuitive function to type someone, the satisfaction comes from figuring out which type matches the blurred image of a person best. This is why typing can be very frustrating, especially for dominant intuitive types. Intuition often comes with a strong sense of certainty that is very satisfying, but once one starts focusing the image and no longer relying on intuition, both the certainty and satisfaction dissipate. The realm of sensation is a realm fraught with uncertainty. A good deal of research and work is required to obtain certainty, which can be exhausting for those not predisposed to it. However, the seemingly certain realm of intuition, as far as typing is concerned, has a few problems with it. First, there's the obvious problem that it blurs the facts. Intuition is good at pointing one in the right direction, but I believe it is almost disrespectful to assume that someone's personality preferences can be determined with no more than a casual glance and a hunch. People are extraordinarily complex, and because Jungian typology is not directly concerned with behavior, but with cognition, which is something we have to dig deeper for, there is no way we can trust intuitive hunches only. An individual, in my opinion, deserves a good lot of work and trouble before we feel certain that we have covered all their angles, and we must always remain open to new discoveries that may change our theory. Second, intuitively typing people relies on having blurred stereotypes of the 16 types into the 8 functions in order to better relate certain people to them. Intuition looks for general patterns and overarching blurs that are easier for it to work with than detailed descriptions with lots of little parts. But as I mentioned at the beginning of every video, I think many of the stereotypes used up to this point are rather misleading and necessarily shallow. This leads into the third point, which is that the creation of such stereotypes is often based in an individual's pre-existing intuitive prejudices. In other words, feeling that typology helps to explain the existence of them, or those kinds of people over there who have always had to put up with. Now I understand what groups them all together and explains them. This feeling often can't tell the difference between the actual functions Jung talked about objectively and the subjective prejudices the typist is now investing into the theory. For instance, suppose someone types as INTP and then sees the feeling function as an explanation for all the annoying people they've seen who judge things by their emotions, when in fact the feeling function has nothing to do with emotion. It has to do with questions of value, of better or best, and can be just as ruthless in its thinking as the thinking function, which in turn can elicit just as much frustration or even fear and emotion as the feeling function is thought to do. If someone judges something to be of inferior value, they might heartlessly dispose of it and be on their way. If someone judges something to make no sense, they might get exceptionally frustrated over it. But this view does not explain what our INTP wants it to explain, and thus does not validate our INTP's way of thinking as a superior way of thinking. In short, one of the most important tips I can give a typist is not to value your own preferences over others. There are many things that people grow up believing are evil, wrong, or even just less valuable points of view, which are in reality just as valid viewpoints as one's own, and have nothing to do with true questions of value. For instance, an INFJ may grow up, and as their preferences blossom and manifest themselves, the INFJ will probably naturally believe that goodness is a standard separate from the individual that they should harmonize or align with. And to say, "to thine own self be true," is actually to endorse stagnation, selfishness, and nihilistic moral relativity. Meanwhile, an INFP would think just the opposite. Evil comes from people giving into the crowd's demands, and giving up on what one knows to be true, while good is emphasizing and solidifying the goodness naturally present in each of us. Thus, each type may feel that in order to validate their own point of view, the opposing viewpoint and associated types must be fundamentally flawed. This begs the question as to whether typology is proposing an amoral system. I adamantly disagree. What I think typology does is help clear up what is definitely not related to morality, so that we can focus on what really is so related. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said in his essay Self-Reliance, "The eye was placed where one ray should fall, that it might testify of that particular ray." The point is, in order to be truly unbiased when typing, one must be willing to admit that their way of looking at the world is fundamentally incomplete, and only one perspective out of many. It does not follow that morality is relative, because Jungian typology is not behaviorist, but cognitive. Murder can be motivated by any one of the functions. Whether or not the murder was right or wrong is another matter. With that clear, there is no moral concern in admitting that one's perspective is limited and biased, but it can be difficult because it ultimately means that sometimes your way of thinking is wrong, and some of the things you cherished and counted for truth were actually nothing of the sort. Until one admits this, it can be difficult to type people without bias. So, to summarize, the two main tips I would give a typist are: 1. Give people the time, effort, energy, and exhaustively thorough research that they deserve, and 2. Be willing to regard your own preferences as fundamentally incomplete. To put it even simpler, research and humility.